I did a top 50 favorite books of all time a year and a half or 2 years ago, and I've wanted to do an updated one ever since because I feel like in that time I've managed to read so many new absolute favorites. So this is that updated version. I'm going to try to be as succinct as I possibly can with each of these books, but there are 50 of them, and I'm going to try to give a little description of what they're about and as to why I love them. I might record this over multiple days, or at least multiple sit downs during the same day, so if things look a little different, that's what's going on. I also wanted to warn you that I'm probably going to repeat myself a lot and say I loved it many times because I genuinely love all these books. I read over 100 books every year. I'm currently at 117 this year alone, and so narrowing down to 50 books over, I won't say my entire lifetime because I didn't really take my childhood into it. It's pretty much from late high school forward. It's over 10 years that I'm looking at every single book I've read and loved and narrowing it into 50. So yes, I loved every single one of these books. I would recommend pretty much every single one of these books. You'll see there's one ranked very high that I just don't in good conscience recommend, and you'll see when we get to it. So I'm going to try not to repeat myself and repeat the same language again and again and again, but I know myself and I know I probably will repeat it. I did write a little script to try to, it's not a script, I should say. It's like a little sheet with bullet points about each of the books so that I will try to hit the things that I want to hit. The further we get in the list, the harder it's going to be for me to define why I love the books, because they're just so perfect for me and I just love them so much and have so many big feelings about them. But I'm really going to try. Please bear with me, and if you've read any of these or want to read any of these, let's talk about it down below. These really are my absolute favorite books of all time, and it did take me days to get this list in ranking order, and there's quite a few honorable mentions. We're not gonna spend a lot of time with them, but I will mention them. So, number 50, boyfriend material. In order to rehab his image and save his job, Luke has to get himself a upstanding boyfriend, and he chooses Oliver, whom he doesn't think he's going to have anything in common with. Oliver figures out pretty quickly it's a fake dating scheme. Has his own reasons for dating Luke, and so the two decide to try to make this fake dating thing work, and of course it blossoms. I adore Alexis Hall's books. I've read all of the like Material World and Boyfriend Material books. London Calling, what is it called? I think it's the Material World. I've read them all, there's 3 of them at this point. And this one is easily my favorite. I love Luke and Oliver's relationship, and I love that this book makes me feel like I too, who am a mess and not nearly as much of a mess as Luke, could someday have a really positive relationship and also a really settled life. It just makes me feel like, even though I'm 28 now, it really makes me feel like I can still grow up into the sort of person I want to be. So it's really reassuring that way, and I just love their relationship. It's really great. I also think Alexis Hall's writing, the way he does tropes, is he'll take you to like the tropey point, so this is the fake dating, then take you beyond the trope and just go all the way, and it's always so interesting and well done. And I think you're gonna see this actually a lot on this list. He does just a phenomenal job playing with the tropes and taking it further than it could be. 49, House of Earth and Blood. This is the first Crescent City book. You've probably heard about it. If not, it is about Bryce, whose best friend was killed, and now several months later, I believe it is, she ends up being involved with the investigation of similar murders happening across her city. It's fantasy, it's epic fantasy set in an urban setting. It is Sarah J Maas's most recent trilogy. The last act of this book is absolutely mind-blowing. I remember I was maybe 20 pages away from it, from getting into like the last like just arc of this book, and I hadn't even realized like that was how close I was. But I sat down thinking I'll just read for a little bit, and I did not get up for like an hour and a half. I was just so engrossed. I was shocked. I was emotional. I was so invested. Now, I do want to point out again that this is favorite books that I've read my entire life. I don't actually think I would have enjoyed this book had I gone into it at a different point in my life. Like if I was picking it up for the first time now, I really don't think I would vibe with it. But at the time when I was reading it, I just mind blown. Number 48, Winter Song. This is a labyrinth retelling. Liesel's sister is taken by the Goblin King, and so to save her, she goes into the Goblin King's realm. I love labyrinth retellings, and I particularly love Winter Song. It does a lot of really wonderful things with music and how music is used in the magic, and the Goblin King and the world of the Goblin King are just so enchanting and amazing to read about. And ooh, I just was really living for literally everything about Liesel and his relationship. It filled me with such joy. It made it onto this list, so obviously I love it, but had I read this when I was younger, because I did read it in 2020 or 2021, had I read this when I was in high school or college, it would have become my fucking personality. Number 47, Battleground. This is the most recent Dresden Files novel, which means I did not bother to count to see which number it was, but it's deep, it's in the teens. This is just one of the most epic books I have ever read, and bonus points because it takes place in Chicago, and one of the battles in it is called Battle of the Bean. This is an urban fantasy series, but I would say this book, and actually a couple books leading into it, but this book really cements it as closer to epic urban fantasy. No one is doing it like this. It's just, I was so invested. I was so engaged. I love the characters. Number 46, Leviathan Wakes. This is the first book in the Expanse series. There are two plot lines. One of them is basically about a noir-style detective, and the other is about the only survivors of a ship after it is destroyed who have found some information that puts them and their whole basically government into jeopardy and what they choose to do with that information. This book is cinematic. I am not someone who is able to really see things in my mind very easily, but this one had me very visually engaged with the book, which is really surprising because I like physically cannot see things in my mind. And so I don't know if I was like seeing the things in this book, but I felt like I was seeing the things. It felt like it could be a big screen movie. I know there's a television show. I didn't really vibe with it. I didn't like some of the character changes they made early on, but I loved this book. And I particularly loved the mystery element, like that noir detective style. I haven't actually continued past book 3 in the series just because I haven't had time, but I do plan to go back to it. But this one it's just great. It also has just really wonderful details and intricacies. I believe it originally started as an idea for an RPG game, and you can really tell it really shines through. Number 45, Little Thieves. This is a retelling and reimagining of the Goose Girl myth, which, if you're familiar with the Goose Girl myth, the maidservant takes the princess's place, and the princess has to kind of fight her way, not fight, but she has to make her way back to her position and prove that she is who she is and get her happy ending. And this is told from the point of view of that maid, sort of. This is far more than a retelling. It is really taking the structure of the Goose Girl and fairy tales like it, and not necessarily turning it on its head, but plumbing the depths of them and giving the character so much more to do. Vanya, our protagonist, is not a particularly likable person, but she's a very likable character. She has a very distinct voice, and her journey and the way that she's healing from trauma and dealing with trauma and just basically learning to become a better person, which feels very belittling of her character arc because it's not quite that. It's so much more than that. It's really healing to read. This was, I believe, originally written as a standalone and can be read as a standalone. It is a whole trilogy. I've read the whole trilogy at this point. I did read an early copy of book 3 and it was really good. But this book is the standout of the trilogy. It's not just Vanya's character that is amazing to read about, but it is Ragni and Giselle and Emmerich, and I do love Emmerich. He's one of my favorite love interests in fiction of all time, and I particularly love his and Vanya's relationship. Really the key here is characters and character arcs and healing, and just how deep Margaret Owen was able to get into this fairy tale and these characters. Number 44, The Longest Autumn. This is a little bit of a harder one to explain, but bare bones is that there's a realm of the gods, one for each season, so winter, spring, autumn, summer, and a realm for the humans. Tierney is a human, but she is a guide for the god Autumn to like bring him into the mortal realm when it's his season, and then into the realm of the gods when his season has ended. But upon entering the human realm, something happens and the portal that connects the two, which is a mirror, breaks, and it does seem to be Tierney's fault, which launches just low-key end of days for the society because the seasons are thrown off, and if they can't figure out a way to get Autumn back when he's supposed to, then the seasons will not be able to continue, and it will be like the longest autumn. I liked this book a lot for how difficult the ending is. It really, The last 150 pages really makes you work emotionally with the text and the characters. It's the right answer to this story because the story is fairly bleak, but it's not so bleak that it doesn't have hope. And the ending, as hard of a pill as it is to swallow, and I think that is maybe why this book didn't sell so well, is it's not marketable into like romantasy. I really appreciate that the author chose to go with the difficult conclusion. I liked the messaging. I liked the growth of the characters. I liked that everything was taken very seriously and the consequences of the mirror breaking were taken seriously. It wasn't a perfect book. There were some things I would have changed, especially for a debut. I was so moved and so touched. And even though it was a little bit of a slow start, once I was invested in it, I never wanted to leave the book. I will say the writing reminded me a lot of Patricia McKillop, so if you're a big Patricia McKillop fan, you'll probably enjoy this one. Number 43, The Raven King. This is the final book in the Raven Cycle series. I'm not going to say much more except to say that it is literally the perfect conclusion to the series, and that when you finish the book, it is so easy to very cyclically slide back into book one and reread it again. And I think there's something incredibly magical and talented about Maggie Stiefvater being able to create this not looped story, but near loop of a story. Number 42, Daughter of the Forest. This is a retelling of the Seven Swans. Is that what it's called? I'll correct myself if I'm wrong. Sorcia's father remarries a wicked stepmother who curses Sorcia's brothers to be swans, and Sorcia, in order to try to rescue them, makes a deal with a forest spirit, but she has to remain silent and complete a very difficult task. While trying to complete this task, she's taken away from her homeland, which obviously complicates things even more. I almost DNF'd this book. I found the beginning very difficult to get into. It was a struggle. I ended up switching from physical book to audiobook, and persevering is really the way to go because it was such a rewarding story and it was beautiful. And even though there were moments that were brutal, and I would recommend looking up trigger warnings for this one if you're considering it, I just loved Sorcia as a character. I loved watching her journey, and she is one of the strongest female characters I have read about. I also just loved, I think it's probably Celtic mythology, but the way that like folklore and fairy tales and mythology is kind of woven into this one, and like fairy-ish stuff was woven into this one, was just so beautiful, and the writing just brings this up above most things that I have read. Number 41, Jade Ward. This is the second book in the Greenbone saga. This is one of the best fantasy trilogies ever written. I stand by that. It is phenomenal. The fact that there is not a television series adaptation of it yet is actually a crime, in my opinion. Also, Fonda Lee, if you write it, I will read it. I'm that big a fan. I'm very excited for her next books. The series is political and social and fantasy, and just, it's everything I want in a good fantasy book, and it's got great, morally great characters. The reason this one is at this place on the list is because it is not my favorite in the series, but it has my favorite scene in the series, which happens a little after the halfway point, and it is an absolutely iconic scene, and if you've read the book, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Altered my brain chemistry. Number 40, Kushiels Chosen. This is the second book in the Kushiels Dart trilogy or Phaedrus trilogy. I loved how much time this one spent on the political maneuverings, and I really loved La Serenissima, which is where quite a bit of bulk of this story takes place. I had so much angst in this one as well because Phaedra and Jocelyn are a little bit going through it because of some things that are happening, and I love just the exploration of Phaedra's religion and the world and the interplay between these countries. I also liked how complicated it was, and it did surprise me by the end when you found out some reveals. This is not my favorite in the series, but again, this has one of my favorite scenes in the series, which comes very near the end. And again, I think it's very iconic, and I think if you've read it, you probably know what I'm talking about. It is a scene that has to do with coins, if you are curious. There's also another actually really great scene, now that I'm thinking about it, that has to do with a bridge. Another really great scene right there, just imprinted on the brain. Number 39, The Lies of Lamora. Locke and his gang, the Gentleman Bastards, are the best con men in the city, but they are not prepared when Locke is swept into someone else's game of revenge. Third time's the charm with this one. I started it twice before and DNF'd it both times, but finally decided I had to give it literally a full shot chance because it's just so iconic and beloved by so many people, and the beginning is rough. I stand by that. The beginning is rough, but oh my god, when it starts going, it had me in a death grip. It had me in a death grip. I would find excuses to go driving so that I could listen to the audiobook of it. It was very fun. It was very dark. There's one scene in the ending that I flip back to and reread all the time because it is set up so perfectly, and when we get to it, it's just so wonderful. And again, not to repeat myself, third book in the row, but I think that that scene is quite iconic. If you've read it, you know what I'm talking about. Surprisingly enough, it also has to do with a coin. Number 38, A Study in Drowning. Effie is an architecture student who gets the chance to design a museum in the home of her favorite author who has passed away. He wrote a book called Angarad, which is about a fairy king who falls in love with a mortal girl, and Effie has her entire life been haunted by the fairy king himself. While she's there, she meets Preston, who is a literature student trying to disprove that Amris Mirrodin wrote Angarad. And so they're sort of academic rivals to lovers. Firstly, I loved Effie. I love her as a character and where her strength comes from and how her strength is represented. I find it very similar to how Cinderella, especially in the live action Disney movie, how Cinderella's strength is shown. She is a survivor, she continues, and I really can connect with that, and I really like that. Secondly, the atmosphere is just like off the charts. I would drown in this book if I could. I cannot wait for the sequel. Number 37, Ocean's Echo. This is another one that's a little hard to explain. It is about Tennel, who is like an upgraded human who can read minds, and Surrit, who is an upgraded human who can influence them, and the two, for like best space travel, pairs of those are needed on ships. They end up being put onto this mission that neither of them wants to be there for, and Tennel is under less than consensual circumstances, so they fake this bonding, but then something happens that causes them to have to go on the run. This book is a non-stop action masterpiece. Every single moment in this book, something is happening, and that something is wonderful. I am also, first and foremost, a lover of angst, and the angst on this book fed me so well. In fact, it fed me so well, I did skip a meal. I remember laying in bed, I was like, no, I have like 100 pages left. I can't even take my eyes away to read. I was so entrenched and absorbed in this book. It became my entire life for a little bit. I cannot wait for Everina Maxwell's next book. I also, as a kind of additional note on top of these things, because I love those probably most, but I really like how she plays with the trope of civilizations having ancient alien artifacts. I think it is wonderful and really proves that it's not just good angst and relationship story, but really good science fiction story. Number 36, Divine Rivals. Rivals to lovers between two newspaper reporters on the front lines of a war between gods. The atmosphere and the world building are just top notch, and I also just really enjoyed the characters. The stakes of the war also felt very real, and I found myself being multiple times very moved by the depiction of both daily life and life on the front lines, and life kind of in between those two. So the city people, the people near the front lines, and then on the front lines themselves. I thought it was done very gracefully with a lot of tact, and I thought it was done very respectfully and emotionally. And I wouldn't call it a war novel, but I do think it gets kind of close to it. Number 35, The Raven Boys. This is the start of the Raven cycle. An incredibly hard series to describe what the plot is about, but yet you're invested the entire time in the plot and the characters so intensely. Gansey is looking for the sleeping king, Owen Glendower, who is from Wales, but is supposedly, he believes, sleeping and buried in the hills of Virginia. Blue is the daughter of a psychic and comes from a family home full of women who are all psychics, but she herself is not psychic. She was told or prophesied that if she meets her true love and kisses him, he will die. And then on St. Mark's Eve, which is something she and her family will celebrate, they'll go watch the spirit roads and take note of people who are going to die that year, because it's like a prediction. You see their spirit, but it's just a prediction that they're going to die that year. While she's there, she, for the very first and only time, sees a spirit, and that spirit is Gansey. So the two cross paths. Gansey's got a group of friends, Adam, Ronan, Noah. They're all really wonderful. The Raven Boys. Blue gets entangled with the Raven Boys and their journey to find Glendower. She doesn't know if Gansey's on the road because he's her true love, or because she's gonna kill him, or probably both. and it's really hard to pin down exactly why this book, why this series. I think if you've read it, you've been taken in at least a little bit by just how talented Steve Otter is of a writer, especially when it comes to building characters and family dynamics, and especially found family dynamics. And I do think that is the heart of the reason that I enjoy the series so much, is because of that found family dynamic. These characters all are ride or dies for each other, and they're all troubled and challenged and challenging, and I just as much in love with them, I think, as they are all with each other. Number 34, Blue Lily, Lily Blue. This is the third book in the series. There are 4 books. Number 2, Dream Thieves didn't make it on this list. I'm so sorry. That book is just like my least favorite in the series. I find it very difficult to get through every time, even though I love Ronan. But Blue Lily, Lily Blue is my favorite, and I'm not going to say anything else except that I think it is perfect how it manages to really add things to the story. Number 33, Sorcery and Small Magics. Leo Vander, Loveage, and Sebastian Grimm are rivals in school, but something happens that causes Leo to be cursed, to have to obey everything Sebastian says, and so the two go on a quest to try to cure it, but they go into the Wildwood, which is dangerous magical forest full of monsters. And this reads like fan fiction. I mean, that is the highest possible compliment. It was addicting and hard to put down, and I'm obsessed. And the reason it is so high on this list, because it's got all these elements that I love in other books like Ocean's Echo. The reason it is so high on this list is because not only is it all of those really wonderful things, but it's the first of a trilogy, and we're following the same protagonist throughout the trilogy, or so I would assume based on the way this ended. I love Winter's Orbit, Ocean's Echo, but I wish it could have just continued the same character. Same with The Last Binding. I want to stay in the head of the same character, and I'm so glad that I get to. Number 32, Prince's Gambit. This is book 2 in the Captive Prince series. C.S. Packet is one of my favorite writers alive. Everything they've read has just been golden and pure and perfect. This book in particular is political fantasy written to its finest. I have never been so engrossed, and I have never been so just breathless at the end of a book. I think I was literally sitting there trying to breathe normally again after finishing it. Number 31. Dark Rise, also by C.S. Packet. You're about to see that we're in a little C.S. Packet pocket. This is about, it's our world, right? I forget exactly when, but the 1900s, I want to say. I'll correct myself if I'm wrong. There's a prediction that the Dark Lord evil guy thing is going to return, and Will is the heir to the savior, is the only one who can stop him. Him and allies have to sort of figure out how to stop this evil guy. Were we talking about tropes again? So it's just, Packet does such a fantastic job with this series of taking all these really classical fantasy tropes and not just spinning them on their head, but making it really reasonable how they're spun on their head. And not just the really obvious Dark Lord, savior, hero, knights, not just those really obvious ones, but there's such a really brutal reckoning with types of side characters and types of things that I would say even go beyond trope, like the depiction of unicorns in this book. The way that they're tackled, it's brutal, but it feels honest. It feels very real. Packet has really convinced me that this is more truthful in some ways than these more traditionally known stories. Also, the angst and the tropes. Those are the 2 keys to my heart. Fuck with tropes and give me all the angst. Number 30, Dark Air. This is the sequel to Dark Rise. It does everything Dark Air did and does it even better. And I've been thinking about that ending every day since finishing it. I think book 3 is coming out in 2025. Number 29, Long Live Evil. Ray is dying of cancer when she is given the chance to enter into one of her favorite books. So it's isekai. And when she enters in, she's put into the body of a side character, Evil Villainess, who the next day in that part of the story is going to be killed. So Ray has to really quickly think on her feet and figure out a way to save herself and also make the best of the situation. She's given a chance through this world to get basically a magical cure, and she has to figure out how to get that and also live. This book is so funny. It's so delightful. It's very dark. I wasn't expecting it to be so dark. It is a world similar to Game of Thrones. I don't think it's as detailed or intricate as something Martin or Hobb would write, but it is not a pale comparison to them. It is very much interested in being a grimdark epic fantasy with a very humorous voice to it. And it works really, really well. Sarah Rees Brendan is one of my favorite authors, and this book had me laughing, it had me crying. There's angst, but there's stuff beyond angst. It had me moved, and I've recommended it to so many people, and no one fucking believes me when I say this book is amazing. I think because they hear isekai and they don't think it's going to be amazing, but it is amazing. It is life-changing amazing. Number 28, The Witch King. Kai is a demon of great renown who fought in the wars that basically saved the world. And the book straddles two timelines. One is the lead up and beginning of this liberation movement, and the other is after this liberation movement. Kai has woken up. Someone has just tried to kill him. He wants to figure out why. He's lost some memories. I call this a hinge story, which now that it's going to be a series, I do wonder if it's going to continue to feel like a hinge story, but taken on its own, because I do think it can be read as a standalone. It is less about the big events than about the moments around big events. If I may compare it to how, you know, like if a grain of sand gets crushed into something long enough, it can like cause a dent, or when water drips onto something long enough, it causes a dent. And that drop of water individually is not maybe the most important seeming thing, but really builds to do this important changing thing, and you can see the results of it. I feel like it is two important hinge moments in the history of this world that we're reading about that Kai is involved in, and it's really interesting. I would also argue that it is hope punk. There's a line near the end especially that is particularly hopeful and that has stuck with me, but I fear saying it might actually possibly be close to spoiler territory, and I really don't want to. Number 27, Nona the Ninth. This is the third book in the Locked Tomb trilogy. I really loved Nona. I love the reveals. It is a wonderful continuation. I liked knowing things, and I loved the characters, and I cried so much at the end. This book and the series really is written on my heart, and in particular the line, "You can't take loved away," is one that really just has become a little bit of a mantra in my own life since reading it. Number 26, The Virtue. This is the second book in the Doctrine of Labyrinth series, which might be a little bit of a deep cut. I don't think a lot of people know this series, which is understandable because it's very dark and brutal. It's by Sarah Monette, who writes under the pen name Catherine Addison. Book 1 leads into book 2 almost immediately, and I will say that the only reason book 2 isn't higher is because book 1 doesn't really slow down, it just launches you through this story. Book 2 does slow down to almost explain things, and I wish it hadn't. I do understand that it makes it more accessible, and if you had to wait in between book 1 and 2, I get it, you probably need a little bit of a refresher, but as someone who binged them back to back, I didn't. I really love these characters. I love how much pain they go through, and I know there's 2 more books after this one. I haven't read them because I'm kind of just trying to believe that they have a happy ending, even though they probably don't. Number 25, Solitaire. This is Alice Husband's debut, I believe. It follows Tori Spring, who, if you've watched or read Heartstopper, is Charlie's older sister, and she's at a point in her life where she's just really not feeling anything anymore. She is very much disassociating almost every moment of her life, and then some strange things start happening at school, especially disrupting her school days, and it seems that they are connected somehow to her, and so she kind of is investigating. I have now read all of Alice Oseman's books, and I did a ranking video if you're curious, and this is the one that stuck with me the most, and I think unfortunately it is because I just connect so strongly with Tori. It's a book I wish I could have read when I was in high school because I think it would have helped me a lot, but at the same time I'm also glad I read it as an adult because it is still very helpful and healing and where I am lately in my mental health journey, but I do think it would have also been even more helpful as a teenager, and I strongly recommend this one to probably everyone. I think it is just really cathartic in a lot of ways. Tori is going through it without necessarily seeming like she's going through it, and it's not a book that has like an easy answer like, oh, you're healed moment. It's a book though that provides a lot of hope that healing is down the line. Book 24 is Golden Fool. This is the second book in the Tawny Man trilogy and the 8th book in the realm of the Elderlings. Of all the series within the series, this is my favorite sub-series. I love the Tawny Man trilogy. I really like Fitz and the Fool's relationship in this trilogy, and I like how it complicates the world further. I also like how much this book in particular takes place at Buckkeep and the sort of courtly life and not necessarily political maneuverings, but Fitz's role there is really interesting to me, and this is my favorite, I think, position for him to have within the entire realm of the Elderlings series. Number 23 is Strange the Dreamer. Laszlo Strange is a librarian who is given the opportunity to go on an adventure to the city of Weep, which is a city that people believed had been lost to time, but is not, and now needs some help. Sarai is one of the remaining daughters of the gods, and she lives in hiding in this floating citadel above the city and is able to, in her, while she's sleeping, or while other people are sleeping, she's able to connect to people via dreams and particularly nightmares, and that is how Laszlo and Sarai meet. Truly, this is a perfect book. It's a book that is YA because that makes the most sense for it to be placed there, but it is one of those books that I really think transcends the age of the reader, something like Golden Compass or Lord of the Rings or Chronicles of Narnia. They are maybe not for the age group. They have to be marketed for one age group because that is just how marketing and publishing works. But I think this is a classic, and I think that it is one that probably any, maybe not really young children, but most people should and could read. It's just really fantastic. It's also very much not the kind of story that would translate to any other medium very easily, and the kind of story that really just sticks with you. Number 22, Will of the Many. This is from a conquered kingdom in an empire that now rules the entire world. And they have a magic system called Will, where they're basically able to sap other people's will and use it if they're more important politically, basically. You have to seed your will, but the more seeds you have, the more powerful you are, and typically that aligns also with where you are in the political structure of the world. And Vis is basically just trying to survive without either seeding his will or using will, and he wants to try to escape to some remote corner of the empire where he can just go unnoticed for the rest of his life. And this is his whole goal, and then he is scooped up by a guy who is like, you know what, I think you'd be a perfect spy. I'm going to send you into this elite academy and use you for my own purposes. And Vis is like, well, I guess I could maybe try to do something with this. It might help me get to my own goals. This is a very good fantasy book. I was invested, I was engaged, I really stressed, and it is really good. And then you get to the epilogue, and it goes from very good fantasy to mind-blowing, amazing fantasy. Was speechless. I am still speechless. And every single person I work with who reads fantasy had to hear me recommend it to them probably 3 times each. Very insistent that everyone reads it because this is, it was so good. I also really like the messaging of the complicity of the citizen when the government you live in and your role in the government is not one that actively is able to change things, and you maybe live a more privileged life because of the government and your complicity within it. I think it is a really complicated discussion, and I look forward to seeing how this progresses throughout the series. Number 21 is Changes. This is the 12th book in the Dresden Files series, and it is indeed when everything in the series changes, particularly the scale and scope of the series. Again, this is where I think it really starts to really head off into epic territory from just urban fantasy to epic. Oh my goodness, we're going into the top 20. Number 20, In Other Lands. This is a story about Elliot, who basically finds out he can see like the other world, and so is given a chance to go to school there, although the school is more similar to something like Camp Half-Blood. It's educational, but it's war camp. And he ends up choosing to go the pacifist route, which is not necessarily super popular with people around him. And he makes friends. This is kind of another hard one to describe because it is so much more about the character arcs and about Elliot himself. The most important character arc in it is Elliot coming to terms with the fact that he deserves to be loved and he deserves to be loved well. And again, I find this book incredibly healing and cathartic. And even just kind of thinking about how Elliot gets to this point is very emotional. It is so charged. And as a bonus, there's just pretty good angst in it as well. Number 19. This is really, before I say what it is a product of when I read it. I think if I was reading this book in the series for the first time now, I really wouldn't have gotten this out of it. But at the time I was reading it, it really left this high of an impact on me. So number 19 is Clockwork Princess. This is the third and final book in the Infernal Devices series, and chronologically the third book in the Shadowhunters Chronicles, if we're not counting the short stories or anything. I read this when it came out, so I think that was 2013. So this is probably the oldest slash earliest read book on this list, and the fact that it has stuck with me this long I think is also really a great testament to it. The thing here is the ending. I think it is just a pitch perfect ending. I had never read anything that so emotionally buoyed me forward as this ending. Number 18, Running Close to the Wind. This is set in the same world as The Taste of Golden Iron and follows a pirate ship. They steal some information that allows them to travel across the sea during the sea serpent's mating season, which is typically a very dangerous time to travel on the ocean, and this puts them at risk and also causes lots of havoc to break out. Okay. I love books with their own internal logic, where when you are trying to discuss a book and tell someone about, you know, what is happening in a particular moment, it is very hard to talk about without then having to explain what something means. I love that. I love that internal logic, and I love when it is like nonsensical. So if I were to talk to you about turtle astrology, you would have no fucking clue what I'm talking about unless you've read this book. And I kind of love that. It's like having a little secret community of people who have read it. And I also just love it because when you're reading the book, you're so entirely immersed in it. And this book just does it so wonderfully. It is also genuinely very funny. And I think it is funny in the same way that Sir Terry Pratchett is funny. So I'm not saying it's necessarily as good as some Discworld books are, because I think people would fight me on it. And I haven't read all the Discworld books. I have read some though. None of them make it on this list. I think it's probably up there with satirical fantasy. It's just fantastic. Number 17, Harrow the Ninth. This is the second book in the Locked Tomb series. Tamsin Muir is just really good at breaking typical narrative structure and making it work for her. And this book is just a spectacle on that level. Also, I am unapologetically a fan of Jade. Sorry. Number 16. Jade City. The fantasy version of The Godfather, I think, is the shorthand most people use. It's about two warring clans of Greenbone warriors, and it does have like a mafia-esque, gangster-esque aspect to it that is not trying to hide that that's what they are. They're crime families, and every single character is morally gray, but you were so invested in them. When I read this book, I was so absolutely swept away. I didn't know what I was going into. I went into it almost entirely blind, and that was for the best because I wasn't prepared for anything that was going to happen, and I loved every single moment of it. And if you haven't read it and you're a fan of fantasy, this is like a must read. I'm not even kidding. This is a must read. I will say that reading this felt to me akin to if I had read A Song of Ice and Fire before the show came out, because I feel like the reveals and the character moments and the mic drop moments are just so good. It is, I think this is one of the best, I think I already said this, one of the best fantasy trilogies ever written. And I think that it's better than anything George R.R. Martin has ever written in his entire life. I'm so sorry if you're a big GOT fan, but I have read the books and I've seen the show. I think this is better. Number 15, Gideon the Ninth. They're all on here, guys. I love the Locked Tomb series. In a bid to become more powerful and closer to the Emperor, each house has sent a representative to compete in trials to become a lictor or lictor. I've not listened to the audiobook, so I'm not 100% sure how to pronounce it, but I say lictor. And each representative from the house also comes with a cav, which is a swords person. And then everyone becomes trapped, and people start dying. So you've got the trials, you've got a locked room mystery, you've got sapphic necromancers in space, and you've got sword fights, and it's just perfect. It's so good. The tension in this book is literally amazing. Gideon is my favorite character, I think, in the entire series, although Harrow is a really close second. And Palamedes is probably a really close third. I could probably just keep ranking them. There's so many that I love. Jade's up there. He's probably fourth. Again, I'm so sorry. I'm unapologetically a fan. I think that this one, being a more traditionally written narrative and a more linear narrative than the other books in the series, and you kind of understand what's going on much quicker in this book, paired with the fact that the narrative voice is so strong and so clear and so brash is why I really love this. I also love the locked room type mystery. That is just something that I personally really like, and a storyline I like to see. So it is my favorite of the trilogy, although I think objectively the best written probably is Harrow the Ninth. Number 14, Fool's Fate. This is the third book in the Tawny Man trilogy and the 9th book in the Realm of the Elderlings series. Tawny Man, I think I already said this, is my favorite subseries, and I really liked this one. I loved that the world building was really allowed to stretch in this one, and I loved that, again, the characters were also really allowed to stretch. This complicates the entire world series in such a amazing way. I remember the last third of this book, I was so tense for days while I was reading it because I was terrified of it ending, but also desperately needed it to be over so that I could know what was happening. I like how it builds off of every single book that's come before it, and also sets up, now that I've read the entire Realm of the Elderlings, I like how it sets up for later books. Just really marvelously. Number 13, A Court of Mist and Fury. This is the second book in the Court of Thorns and Roses series. And again, this book came to me in a time when I really, really, really needed it. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about it because I think it does get a lot of time from a lot of people. And again, it's not a book that I think if I was picking it up now would really hit me emotionally the same way it did when I read it. But at the time, Farah's journey was something I needed to be reading about, and I found it incredibly helpful for myself and very illuminating for myself as well. It also really changed the game with female character arcs in YA and new adult fantasy. No one else was really doing it the same way that Sarah J Maas was. I really like the shift that it has provided in the publishing space. Looking back at it, I don't think it's perfect, but really at the time, people joke, and I think I even joke, and I've said it, things changed my brain chemistry. This really did change how I view characters and what I need out of a story. It really did alter my brain chemistry. And I think for the better. Also, as a complete side note, I had never, at the point that I read this book, which is when it came out, I had never read a book where the male love interest gave head to the female character and didn't expect anything in return. That was actually a moment that was incredibly mind-blowing for me. I was like, damn, yeah, maybe she doesn't have to start with a blowjob. Number 12, Silver Under Nightfall. A vampire hunter and two vampires have to team up to figure out what is causing the undead to become mindless killing machine zombie things. I was absolutely obsessed with this when I was reading it. Again, the angst, phenomenal. So good. It's just a book about angst. It is just a book where things are happening that cause angst. That is what it's about. I really liked the characters, and I really liked that it was a poly-romance. I think this is the first poly-romance I ever read, and that was definitely integral to me as a reader and a person. Number 11, Kushiels Dart. Phaedra No Deloni is trained as a courtesan and a spy, and becomes embroiled in a very large conspiracy that is trying to basically destroy her entire kingdom. Number 1, the world building. It's beautiful. It's sex positive. It is unique. Number 2, the court politics. This is, in my head, the political fantasy. This series and the Captive Prince series are the two big hit political fantasies that I've ever read, and I would say this is the one that really lays the groundwork. Yes, A Song of Ice and Fire is political fantasy, but that is not, I would say, the only or main strength of it, whereas with the Phaedra trilogy, that is the main strength of it, and I love it. I also just love Phaedra. She's one of my favorite female protagonists. I like that she's a non-traditional protagonist, especially compared to the sort of protagonists we're seeing in fantasy today, and I liked her and Joshelin's relationship a lot. Honorable mentions. I'm just going to read this directly off the page I wrote. I am not going to go into any of them. I do recommend you look them up. They're all really great. These are in no particular order. Wild Sheep Chase, This Fatal Kiss, Blood Rights, Kingdom of Ash, Empire of the Vampire, Emily Wilde, the first one, The Stars Undying, The Tainted Cup, Holy Terrors, Sword Crossed, Brideshead Revisited, The Hurricane Wars, Lies We Sing to the Sea, Anne's House of Dreams, Husband Material, A Far Wilder Magic, The Atlas Paradox, The Magicians, and Docile. So we're about to go into the top 10. These are incredibly hard for me to talk about coherently. If you thought I was really losing steam in the previous 40 and losing unique and different things to say and not being super precise. It's about to get a whole lot worse because I love these books. And I love them so entirely that pulling out a specific piece here or there is not easy for me. Every little bit that makes these stories up, from the characters to the plot to the angst or the tropes or the world building and the writing, it's all just everything. It's just all of it is everything to me, and it's all perfect. Ranking them took very hard, but I'm very satisfied with the ranking I gave them, and I'm really sorry if it starts to sound nonsensical. As Mr. Knightley says in Emma, if I loved you less, I might be able to talk about you more. Number 10, Assassin's Fate. This is the final book in the Realm of the Elderlings series, and this ending is perfect. It builds off of every single book that came before it for the most satisfying conclusion I have ever come across. I don't think there's a single other author out there writing with that level of talent that Robin Hobb is writing with when it comes to through lines and connections. It really was a perfect ending to a very long series. Number 9, Melusine. Felix is a sorcerer and Mildmay is a thief in the winding city of Melusine. Felix's abuser returns around the same time that Mildmay goes through a loss, and both things trigger these men to go on very different but parallel quests that do ultimately lead to them meeting up. This is the first book in the Doctrine of the Labyrinth series. I mentioned the Virtue earlier, and this one is fantastic. It is non-stop, consistent, going. It is dark. I really would recommend trigger warnings. There are a lot of triggers, particularly immediately you enter the book and terrible things start happening immediately, and the book is absolutely mining the characters for all the trauma and all the pain they can give, and I absolutely ate it up. I loved the characters, I loved the writing, I loved the world building, I loved the voice and the very particular speaking style that they have. It is completely immersive and it is a difficult read, and it's really great. A hidden gem. Number 8, Pride and Prejudice. New neighbors move into the town, changing the Bennet sisters' life. Side note, coming up with a really succinct description of this was both very easy and very difficult. Pride and Prejudice is the first classic that I read on my own for fun that made me realize I could not only engage and enjoy classics on my own time, but also that Jane Austen is one of my favorite writers. I love the relationship between Elizabeth and Darcy, and I particularly love their character arcs separately and together. Number 7 is Fool's Errand. This is the first book in the Tawny Man trilogy and the 7th book in the Realm of the Elderlings. This is my favorite Robin Hobb book, in large part because it is a very small scale story and the plot that is happening is very small scale, and yet Robin Hobb manages to make it feel like it has the same epic proportions as the quests in her other books. I really love seeing how talented she is, and I also really enjoyed how this is probably the happiest book in the series, and sometimes when you just love a character you want to see them mostly happy. Number 6, Swords Point. In a city where sword duels are a key part of both the political and social landscapes, and the divide between the haves and the have-nots is very great, we follow the greatest swordsman alive. This book, I feel like it was written specifically for me because it just has every small key element that I love. It is a very wintry book, and in fact, hot chocolate is the drink of choice. It is a queer positive world. It has sword fighting and sword duels, and it has political maneuverings and just really great characters. It's a character-driven manor punk, and actually that's the other big thing. This is the originator of the manor punk subgenre, and that is one of my, if not my, favorite subgenres of fantasy. But really, it comes down to, I feel very much as if this book could have been written specifically for me because it has every little piece is a building block of a thing I love. Number 5, The Wise Man's Fear. This is the sequel to Name of the Wind. I love Name of the Wind. I think it is a much tighter story than The Wise Man's Fear, and yet The Wise Man's Fear takes a lot of tropes. There's that keyword again. It takes a lot of the tropes that I already love, and I wouldn't say twists them, but really sort of almost like cuts them open and fractures them, and you get to see it from a completely different angle, and I really liked that. I also really like how much breathing space is in this book. I'm a big proponent of having breathing space in fantasy. if you can manage it, and I do think Rothfuss manages it. I say a lot of times that even if there is no third book in the series, I am actually quite satisfied with the 2 that we have. Number 4. A Little Life. We follow 4 friends, but most particularly Jude, who has lived a life almost completely filled with exclusively trauma, and it is a very hard read. This is the only book on this list that I do not recommend, just because I don't think with a good conscience I can recommend it. I would never tell someone not to read it, but I would warn them, even if they're not going to look up specific trigger warnings, that it is probably the darkest, most traumatic book they will ever read. When I finished reading this book, and I have a vlog, oh my god, that's one of the first videos I posted. I have a vlog. I'm not gonna link it because I don't know how I feel about it. But if you scroll back, you could find it. When I finished it, I felt like I had just been to like my best friend's funeral. It was a very hard book to get through. That said, even though it is basically trauma porn and just terrible thing after terrible thing after terrible thing, I think it is a testament to the power of storytelling and the power of writing to be able to make the reader feel as much as they do. This is a very singular book, and I hope it stays a very singular book. I don't think I would want to be able to put myself through anything similar to this. I do ultimately love it. It's in the top 4 for a reason. Number 3, Piranesi. A very hard book to describe. There is a house. The house is endless. There is a man in the house. I do think this is a book you go into with as much blindness as possible. It's really a marvelous story, and I think the strongest thing I can say about why I love this book is because reading it made me feel like a child discovering stories for the very first time. It's doing new things, but it's also just evoking the heart of what makes reading so engaging and the power of stories that I think I've said that a couple times and it sounds a little hokey, but it is really drilling down into the perfect distillation of the magic of stories. Number 2, the Goblin Emperor. Maya is exiled from court merely for existing, which is why when his father and his brothers, who are the emperor and heirs to the empire, all die in a terrible crash, he becomes the emperor. This book is hope punk. It is a story about kindness and being kind. It is a story about forming connections and sticking to who you are as a person, even when you're put into situations that you couldn't have predicted and that are more or less made to try to turn you into a different person. It's about kindness. It's the most heartfelt story I think I've ever read, and I genuinely feel like a better person having read it. This is a fantasy book, and you know, it has everything else I want that I've mentioned. If I mentioned in this video, probably this book is doing it and doing it really, really well. Tropes, angst, characters, world building, writing, but it's so much more than all of those things, and it is also the sort of fantasy novel that I think everyone should read because it uses the genre to get across an incredibly human message, which again is kindness. And number 1, I consider this novel perfect to a T. There is nothing wrong with it. I read it almost every year, and every time I find new things to love and I encounter everything I already love. It is a story about stories. It is a wintry novel. It is a book for people, adults, who are still opening up the wardrobe and really do believe that one day Narnia might be there at the back of it. This book is The Starless Sea. That's it. Those are my top 50. I'm so glad to share them all with you. While I was making the list, I had quite the urge to go back and reread most of these, but I did not let myself because I knew that would be quite distracting and prevent me from finishing this list. But I genuinely love every single one of them. I think I've made that quite clear. Please take all of these except A Little Life as recommendations because they are... I think there was a trend going around on TikTok at one point and it was like, what books do you associate with me? And I really hope that at least some of these books are associated with me or become associated with me. I do think people at work and friends in IRL might associate some of the books with me, which means job well done. Anyway, this is a long way of saying thank you for watching. Thank you for caring about what my top 50 are. Thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for subscribing if you did. And I hope you're having a great rest of your day. Bye.